Imagine this. You are standing in the middle of a noisy factory in the early 19th century where girls barely in their teens have to work 14 hours a day for a wage only half of what men earn. Yet it is precisely from their sweat tears and silent uprisings that the whole history of labor and women's rights turned in a completely different direction. Today, I'm going to tell you that rarely mentioned story, and perhaps it will make you look at your work and your life in a very different way. Imagine we are turning back time, returning to Europe and North America around the years 1820-1850. Everywhere, the quiet fields and villages are slowly changing. Above the low roofs, factory chimneys begin to rise, spewing thick smoke. The sound of looms, gears, and factory whistles drowns out the birds and the chatter of people in the markets. That is when the story of early industrialization and women's labor truly begins. Not with dry numbers, but with the lives of millions of ordinary women. Among them, let us follow a young girl we will call Mai. She is not really English, French, or American. Mai is like a composite character representing many girls who lived in that era. Through Mai's story, everything about early industrialization and women's labor will become easier to picture and easier to understand. Mai was born into a poor peasant family in a remote village. From childhood, her life was tied to the fields, to the harvest seasons, to herding cows, tending chickens, helping her mother spin and weave in the low, smoky kitchen. Back then, her family had no concept of going to work for wages or monthly salary. Everyone worked for their own household, planting, harvesting, raising livestock, weaving cloth, making food. Each person had a task. No one was idle, but no one thought of themselves as a worker. They were simply family members working for the family. But little by little, Mai's village started hearing new rumors. People said that in the town across the river, someone had built a big factory with machines that could weave cloth faster than 10 people working together. The elders shook their heads, saying, "With machines like that, who will need human hands anymore?" The young people were curious. If the machines work that fast, people working there must earn a lot of money. Now and then, some men from the village would return after working far from home and tell stories that at the textile mills, the owners needed many workers, especially women and children, because they were dexterous and their wages were lower than men's. One evening, Mai's father came home with a worried look. After several bad harvests, the family's debts had piled up, taxes kept rising, and they did not have enough to eat. After a frugal meal, he said to Mai and her mother, "I hear the textile mill in town is hiring many women workers. You don't need much schooling, just hard work and diligence. If you go there for a few years and send money back, our family can pay off these debts and fix the leaky roof." Mai's mother was silent for a moment, then looked at her daughter. She knew this was a difficult decision. Until then, daughters stayed home to help the family married nearby and rarely left the village. But the times had changed. If they clung to the fields, the whole family might exhaust themselves and still remain poor. So after several sleepless nights, the family decided to let Mai go to town to work in the factory. On the morning, she left her mother, wrapped some dry cakes for her, patched her old shirt one more time, and said, "Up there, remember to take care of yourself. Don't trust strangers. Don't overwork. If anything happens, ask someone to write a letter home for you." Mai hugged her mother, her father, and her younger siblings. She was excited because it was her first time leaving the village, but also scared because everything ahead was unknown. When Mai arrived in town, the first things that struck her were the taller buildings, the busier streets, and most of all, the tall black factory chimneys that were always spewing smoke. The air smelled of coal oil and new cloth, very different from the smell of straw and muddy fields back home. The shrill factory whistle sounded, announcing the beginning of the work shift. Crowds of people, most of them women and children, poured through the factory gates like a strong current of water. Mai was hired to work in a weaving mill. On the very first day, she was taken through a large room. Dozens, hundreds of looms stood close together, powered by water or steam. Each time the machine started, the whole room shook with clattering, rumbling sounds like thunder. White threads flew everywhere, clinging to the workers' hair and clothes. The smell of lint made her cough and choke. The foreman, a middle-aged man with a leather whip in his hand, paced back and forth almost constantly, watching everyone. "You'll be standing here," an older woman worker led Mai to a loom. "Your job is to watch the threads. If one breaks, tie it back. If the cloth has a flaw, report it. In a few weeks, you'll get used to it. Be sure to stay focused or the machine will catch your hand." Mai nodded, but inside she was trembling. She had never stood next to a machine so big and so loud. That day, she worked with her eyes glued to the loom. Whenever a thread snapped, she rushed to slip her hands in and tie it back, and many times the thread cut into her skin, burning and stinging. She did not dare complain, because everyone around her was absorbed in their work, and anyone who dared straighten their back for a moment under the foreman's eye was scolded harshly. The workday stretched from dawn to dark. Breaks were just a few short moments to eat a piece of bread or drink a sip of water. There was no such thing as getting off work early or a break between shifts like we know today. With every passing hour, Mai's legs went numb, her back ached, and her eyes burned from staring at the tiny threads all day. But she knew that if she quit, who would send money home to her family? At the end of the day, when the factory whistle signaled that the shift was over, all the workers sighed with relief. They streamed out of the factory, their faces coated in dust, their hair sprinkled with white fibers. Mai returned to the women's dormitory, a cramped, damp row of houses. In one small room, up to 12 girls slept together in stacked bunks. The air was heavy with the smell of sweat and damp cloth. But Mai still felt that compared to those sleeping out on the streets, she was fortunate. That night, lying on the thin mattress, Mai listened to the stories of the more experienced workers. They said, "Here there are no days off like in the village. We only get 1 day off a week, and even then, the owner often makes us work overtime if there are many orders. The wages are low, and there are endless deductions. Late 1 minute they deduct. Tear the cloth they deduct. Talk too much they deduct. But it's still better than starving in the countryside." Another girl clicked her tongue. "That's how it is for us girls. At home, we're under our parents and husbands. In the factory, we're under the foreman and the owner. Wherever we go, we're the weak ones." Those words echoed in Mai's mind. She realized she was not the only one who felt tired and wronged. All the girls around her, from those who had just started to those who had worked there 5 or 7 years, shared the same fate, working themselves to the bone, earning low wages, and receiving little respect. Yet factory work did give them something they had never had before: wages. However small it was, money they themselves earned, not something they had to ask their fathers or husbands for. Every payday, Mai set aside most of her earnings to send home, keeping only a little for herself, to buy small things, a scarf, a pretty button, or a bit of sweet pastry for her rare days off. The feeling of holding in her hand money she had earned with her own labor gave her a quiet sense of pride. Time passed, and the factory kept running day after day. Outside, society was changing too. Men of learning in the cities began to write newspapers and books about the working class, about injustice, in the factories about children and women being overworked. Some churches and charitable organizations visited the workers' quarters, bringing porridge clothing and offering evening literacy classes. Mai heard that somewhere there had already been strikes where workers, many of them women, stopped work together to protest wage cuts and demand shorter hours. One day, while Mai was tying a broken thread, a whisper passed from one worker to another. "Tonight after work, some of the older women are meeting at the end of the dormitory row. They're going to talk about wages and such." Mai was both anxious and curious. That afternoon, she tried to work carefully to avoid being fined. In the evening, she quietly followed the others. In the cramped room, more than 20 girls sat shoulder to shoulder. An older woman who had worked at the factory for many years began. "Sisters, lately the owner has lowered piece wages again, but the hours are the same, maybe even longer. Are we tired? Yes. Do we feel this is unfair? Yes. But if we all stay silent, things will only get worse." At the mill across the river, the workers joined together in protest. They wrote a petition to the authorities demanding higher wages and shorter hours. "We have to think about speaking up too," another girl said timidly. "But if we protest and the owner fires us, what? Then I have a bunch of younger siblings waiting for the money I send home." The older woman looked around and spoke slowly. "We're all scared. I'm scared too. But if we never do anything, they will keep exploiting us forever. Each of us alone is weak, but if hundreds of us speak together, they can't fire us all. Besides, in the city there are now some men, scholars, lawyers, priests, who support the workers. They can help us write petitions and speak out in the newspapers." Mai listened, her heart pounding. She had never thought that she, a village girl, could do anything other than keep her head down at the loom. But when she saw the determined look in the older women's eyes and the mixture of anger and exhaustion on everyone's faces, she understood that this was not just about a couple of coins, but about dignity, about having a life that was a little less harsh. The next day, and on many days after that while working, the girls used every moment to whisper to each other and pass around small slips of paper on which a few simple demands were written: reduce working hours to 10 hours a day, no arbitrary wage deductions, protect pregnant women, no whipping workers. Today, these demands may sound obvious, but in those days, they were bold and daring. Sometimes the foreman discovered some of the troublemakers. They were cursed at and even fired on the spot. Fear hung in the air. Mai worried that her name might end up on a blacklist. But at the same time, she felt something new was taking shape, like a small flame spreading in the hearts of people who had long been used to bowing their heads in silence. Outside the factory, society had other conflicts related to women as well. In wealthy urban families, people still repeated the idea: a good woman is one who stays at home, cares for her husband, raises her children, keeps moral virtue, cooks and embroiders. That is her calling. This was the so-called ideology of separate spheres. Men belong to the outside world, work politics earning money. Women belong to the inside world, home kitchen morality. But reality was very different. Tens of thousands of women like Mai were standing in factories, working harder than many men and earning money, even if they were paid less. They stepped out of the private sphere of the family into the factory, into the noisy, crowded workers' quarters. They heard stories, told stories, discussed wages, laws, and strikes. Slowly and quietly, they were breaking the image of women belonging only in the home. However, even after joining the wage labor force, most women still had to shoulder a second shift after work. Married women with children after leaving the factory rushed to cook, wash clothes, bathe the children, and clean the house. They had almost no time for themselves. Society at that time hardly recognized this as labor that deserved support or sharing. It was simply seen as women's natural duty. Mai, still young and unmarried, only had to take care of herself after work. But she saw older women with small children struggling through long shifts while worrying about paying someone to watch their children cheaply and constantly anxious about what they would do if their children fell ill. Many pregnant women still had to stand all day at the looms. No one thought of giving them rest or reducing their hours. Sometimes the workshop echoed with the muffled sobs of a woman who had miscarried from overwork. It was precisely such stories that slowly made many people, men and women alike, start asking themselves, are women merely weak creatures in need of protection, or are they a real labor force making a huge contribution to society? That question was not easy to answer right away, but it could no longer be ignored. Then little by little, small steps forward appeared. In some places after protests, factory owners were forced to give ground, shortening the workday a bit, raising wages a little, or banning whipping. Some governments began passing laws to restrict labor for very young children and to set maximum working hours. These measures were still far from what workers and women wanted, but they were the first building blocks. At the same time, in many cities, groups of middle-class women who had the opportunity to learn to read and write began to speak out. They wrote books and articles about the lives of women workers, about the need for women to have access to education, property rights, and the right to participate in certain public activities. Some even talked about women's suffrage, an idea many people at the time called crazy. Yet these crazy ideas later became the seeds of the powerful feminist movements of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Back to Mai. After several years at the factory, her hands were calloused, and her eyesight had worsened from the lint and from straining to see the threads every day. She had witnessed many accidents, girls losing parts of their fingers to the machinery women having their hair caught in the wheels because they did not tie it back in time. The factory compensated them very little, and many had to return to their villages in pain, becoming a burden on their families. Mai asked herself, if I stay here all my life, what will become of me? Will I marry, have children, and see my children enter the factory at a young age like those kids there? That question gnawed at her. But at the same time, she realized that thanks to her years in the factory, she had changed. She was no longer the girl who knew only her village. She had learned to read a little in the evening classes run by charitable groups. She could roughly calculate her wages, rent, and remittances to her family. She knew that out there people were talking about workers' rights and women's rights. On a rare, longer break, Mai returned to visit her village. Neighbors gathered around her to ask about life in the factory. Some were envious when they saw her nice scarf and new shoes. Others shook their heads and said, "It's still better in the village. At least we don't have to breathe dust and smoke all day." Mai told them frankly, "It's very hard there, but at least I can send money home. Here in the village, after a string of bad harvests, how would we survive?" Her mother looked at her with pride and sorrow. She understood that her daughter had grown up in a way very different from her own generation. Gradually, Mai's village also lost its old calm. Some young people left for the city and never returned. Some families shifted from farming to weaving cloth at home or sewing clothes for shops in town. The line between rural and industrial life became more blurred than before. These changes deeply affected women's roles in both family and society. Seen from a broader perspective, we can say that in this early industrial period, women were both more exploited and also the pioneers of new paths. They accepted work under terrible conditions, low wages, and social contempt. But it was precisely by entering the factories, earning wages, taking part in debates and strikes, and signing petitions that they helped change how society understood labor and gender. From the image of the woman who belongs only in the kitchen, they gradually became workers in a clear, undeniable sense. Their contributions were no longer just pots of food and clothes for their families, but hundreds of meters of cloth and thousands of goods for the market. Even though society at the time did not fully recognize their contributions, history has recorded that in every struggle for better working conditions and labor rights, women were always there. In the long run, these experiences accumulated into a kind of collective memory of women workers. The daughters of the first generation of women workers would grow up in a world where women working outside the home was no longer so strange. They would hear their mothers' stories of exhausting night shifts, of being scolded unjustly by foremen, of marching in strike lines. From that, they would understand that rights do not fall from the sky. They are built from the sweat tears and even the blood of many generations. Looking from today, we can easily see the legacy that the early industrial period left to women workers first. It made clear that women are an indispensable part of the working class. No one could credibly say anymore that only men earn money, women only stay home. Even though they were paid less, women were still the backbone of industries like textiles, garments, food processing, and services sectors that fed the whole new industrial society. Second, it created the need for organization. Women no longer worked entirely alone, but began to understand that they had to unite with one another, with male workers, and with sympathetic intellectuals to create a common voice. From the small dormitory meetings that Mai attended, associations, unions, and broader labor movements gradually formed, with women playing increasingly important roles. Third, it laid the groundwork for later movements demanding gender equality. If women could work 12, 14 hours a day in factories, how could anyone say they were too weak or incapable of political thought? If they could earn money to support their families, why should they not have the right to decide about property, marriage, or their own bodies? These questions were voiced and written and debated more and more in society. And those very questions led to later struggles for women's suffrage, for access to education, and for professional careers. Finally, it teaches us a simple but profound lesson. Any major social change like industrialization is never just about machines, factories, or railways. It is always tied to the concrete lives of real people, especially the vulnerable, such as women and children. When we say early industrialization and women's labor, behind those words lies an entire world of women like Mai, of older factory hands, of mothers in the countryside, of young girls reading under dim lamps after long shifts. If we return to the image of Mai at the end of the story, after many years of work, she might choose to go back to her village using her savings to open a small shop, or she might stay in the city and find a job that is less grueling now that she has some skills and connections. Whatever path she chooses, the years she spent in the factory, the exhausting shifts, the secret meetings, the wages she sent home, have become part of the quiet but persistent history of women workers. And when we in the 21st century sit down to retell this story in a clear and relatable way, we are continuing an invisible thread stretching from the 19th century to today. That thread is woven from the sweat of women in the first factories, from their small but stubborn voices, and from a very simple belief: women like men deserve a life of fairness and respect.